Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for that generous introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming out to this beautiful hall tonight. Last time I spoke at CG, it wasn't in this new hall, it was in the older space. And I was doing my more typical routine, which is talking about the many other parts of the world where overpopulation is the much larger problem to be talking about. There really are very few countries in the world where the word underpopulation would make any sense at all. It's a political reality in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And I don't think it could ever become a concept anywhere else. We have plenty of countries where the devastation of population shrinkage is a major problem. And by the middle of this century, that'll be the majority of countries. But underpopulation is sort of a new concept here. Now, I'm going to do something that I haven't done with previous books I've written in giving talks, where I often show photos of interesting locations and so on. I'm actually going to read a few pages from this book, partly because it opens with a story that I think sort of sets the scene very well and helps explain where I'm coming from for this. And it's a story about my family in a chapter called The War Against the Outside. Around midnight, on an early winter evening, 180 years ago, my grandmother's great-grandmother stood in fury as a crowd of armed rebels forced their way inside her Brantford house, demanding the rifles and pistols she and her Welsh-born husband, William, had spent the day hiding. The couple had armed themselves that autumn, and William had worked to organize a local militia in the certain belief that they would soon be joining an all-out civil war over the size, composition, and purpose of Canada. 12 of them came down to us in the middle of the night, demanding arms. They had each suspended to their sides swords and rifles. They searched the house, but William, being a strong Tory, had the precaution to hide his guns and pistols. Catherine Lloyd-Jones, then 36 and a mother of 3, wrote her mother in England. They left disappointed, but they told us to beware of the rabble. As the men departed in frustration, William yelled after them that he would be joining the fight, but not on their side. The couple knew these rebels, Canadian men from the nearby village of Scotland, men who had resided in Canada far longer than they had. But Catherine denounced them and their fellow rebels as Americans, for she and other Tories saw these men's expansive and democratic ideas, their support of public education and open borders and elected governments, as treasonous and foreign. I then felt alarmed and rather dreaded the consequences of refusing them arms, Catherine wrote. Fancy me, close to William's elbow, pale as death in my nightdress, covered with a cloak. I think I could almost have fired at them myself. They spent the next several weeks sleeping fully dressed, with weapons at their side, prepared to flee the house, pistols in hand, and join the coming fight. What a country this is, my dear mother, Catherine lamented to her overseas family. This has come to nothing but war, and civil war, worst of all, being in danger of being shot by our neighbors. People are in danger of their lives unless armed with their pistols, even to go a mile from their own home. Little did we anticipate a bloody war which will eventually take place. Catherine's fears were only partially realized. Civil violence, rifle battles, and a serious national crisis did ensue, but the war that took place in the days after Catherine's letter, today known as the 1837 rebellions, would not prove as bloody or as lengthy as my ancestors feared. The reformers who launched and fought in the rebellions were tried and transported to Australia, forced to flee to the United States, or executed. What Catherine had in mind was the far larger but less violent civil war that had been underway as long as she'd lived in Upper Canada, one that had been launched by Canada's British occupiers almost the moment the War of 1812 had ended a quarter century earlier. It was a war to limit British North America's ambitions, its size, and its purpose. While the enemies were often described as Americans, all of them were in fact long-standing residents and subjects of the Canadian colonies. The border with the United States had been slammed shut to migration after 1815, so the US-born families of Canada, who until the 1830s were the majority of Upper Canada's population, had lived there much longer than most British-born settlers. The colonial rulers did not hesitate to call this clash of loyalties and visions a war, or to specify what it was they were fighting. Sir Francis Bond Head, the Tory Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, had urged British Anglicans, among them Catherine and William, to emigrate to the colony after 1815 by telling them they'd be soldiers in, quote, a moral war between those who were for British institutions against those who were for soiling the empire by the introduction of democracy. The conflict involved much more than democracy versus British institutions, though. It was an all-out struggle to ensure that the emerging Canada would be a closed, ethnically homogenous colony whose political and economic function would be limited to the provision of raw materials to the imperial capital, and whose population would be restricted mainly to smallhold farming. This was a vastly different place from the pre-1812 Canada. Though tiny and sparse, that earlier Canada had been defined by an ambiguous and open border, diverse immigration, cooperative relations with indigenous nations, and a free-flowing trade in goods, people, and ideas with the newborn United States, all of which were now forbidden. This was a war against expansion and openness. Catherine and William saw their ideas triumph, though William would die 8 years later when he fell off the back of a wagon. Canada's border would remain closed and tariff-walled for decades. Its immigration policies would allow only a certain sort of British person. Its economy would remain colonial, rural, and resource-based. This victory would exact a heavy and lasting cost on Canada. For the rest of the 19th century, and much of the 20th, the new country would fail to attract people, despite a constant effort to do so. Underpopulation would become a constant and lasting problem. So that's my opening premise. A pile of letters from an ancestor of mine that have been passed from generation to generation in my family, which raised a sort of curious picture of Canada forming in the early 19th century, and was part of a puzzle that had sort of mystified me during the decade and a half when I lived away from Canada in the United States and then in Britain. And when you live away from a country, from your home country, you start to see it differently. You start to see what you love about it a lot more. It becomes clear that the people who come from that country are distinct sort of people, even if they're from very diverse regions and linguistic areas and time zones and so on. You recognize that there actually is a common something about the people who come from your country. You also start to see its peculiarities in a way you wouldn't before. And Canada looks very different from a distance. When you start to recognize that it developed and shaped in different ways from other former colonies around the world. And one of the big questions that arises is, why did we end up with so few people? And from that, you'd get the following questions: is that still a problem? Are we still shaped by the sparsity of our population? What could we do about that? And so on. But really, the starting point is that question: why did the United States end up with a couple 100 million people in a period of time when Canada hardly attracted anybody? And the first answer that people give is, well, it's the weather. And I actually have a whole passage in Maximum Canada titled "No, It Isn't the Weather." Canada suffered for most of its history until the end of the Second World War a loss of people. Almost every decade during that 90 years before the 1940s, more people left Canada for other countries than came as immigrants. And I think this is the flaw in our public education and vision that was the starting point for this. That was the story I wanted to tell. We all learn in our school classes about the ships full of Irish and British and then Germans and Ukrainians and Chinese showing up and people getting off. We don't learn about the even larger groups of people who depart. Historians know about this, demographers know about this. Every decade of the 19th century, except the 1850s, more people emigrated out of Canada than immigrated into it. During the Great Migration from Europe, when 40 million people left Europe to get on ships for the New World. Every year during that period, Canada suffered a net migratory loss of people. They went to other places, or if they came, they didn't stay. In the 90-year period up to 1945, a period when the United States attracted a couple 100 million immigrants, Canada had only attracted 6.7 million immigrants, and it lost 6.3 million people to emigration. So we barely grew as a population. Why did that happen? What I look at are the voices of the people who did leave. And for some communities, it was absolutely enormous, of course. Quebec lost, within a period of a few decades, a fifth of its population to New England. The settlement of the prairies until well into the 20th century failed. The people who were settled during the drives of the late 19th century on the plains generally got up and left for the Dakotas, which by the end of the 19th century had more people than the entire Canadian West. And again, it wasn't the weather. The people were not leaving Canada for California or Hawaii. They were leaving for the Dakotas and for New England. So why did that happen? And what you hear when you listen to the voices of Canadians, and there were exceptions, I should add. The 1850s were a decade when people came and stayed in Canada. A lot of them were Irish people who were on the edge of death from cholera and so on, but that decade more people stayed. Not coincidentally, as I discover, that was the one decade before the 1980s when Canada had free trade with the United States. And when you start listening to why people left or stayed, that has a big part to do with it. The 1910s, of course, were the other period when Laurier brought in tons of people from Eastern and Southern Europe to settle the Canadian West. And to their credit, most of them didn't settle the Canadian West, they settled the Canadian cities. And they stayed until there was an election fought in 1911 over Borden's two big slogans, "No Trader Truck with the Yankee," and "For a White Canada," which he won by a huge margin. And remember, Ukrainians and Italians were not white in those days, so he was speaking about stopping larger numbers of people. Those were the two exceptions, though. During pretty much every other period, we lost more people than we gained. And if you talk to people about why, and Canada did flourish, Canada did grow in population because we had a lot of children, but very slowly and in a sparse way. And if you listen to the voices of people speaking about why they didn't stay, it wasn't because they didn't like the weather, it wasn't because they were opposed to the idea of Canada in general. It was because they really couldn't make a go of it. It was really, really hard to make a go of it. Partly because Canada had decided to develop, after about the period when I'm writing about my ancestors in Upper Canada in the 1830s, in a way that closed the north-south border and attempted to develop as a source of raw materials for the imperial capital. And that meant that, first of all, if you wanted to start a farm or a business or something like that, anything you wanted to get was going to be very, very expensive, any equipment or things you needed. And your range of markets were going to be extremely limited. You basically had the CPR as your monopoly form of transportation, which charged exorbitantly higher than the US railways, and you had Britain as your market. I mean, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but that was basically the pattern. And not only that, but what grew from that basic fact of the difficulties of attempting to maintain colonial trade. Remember, during a period when Britain had given up on this idea of using its colonies as sources of staples and so on. They were trying to offload Canada and have robust trade in manufactured goods and services with the United States and other places. Canada was trying to maintain this method that drove people away. And the corollary of that was that we developed a form of settlement that involved filling the land with people for strategic reasons, rather than attempting to create cities and communities and economies. And our immigration drives generally failed. John A. Macdonald's big immigration drive, it was a huge effort. They sent agents all over Europe to try to attract people. During that entire time, we lost more people than we gained. Laurier's succeeded, but then the drives of the 1920s and 30s generally failed to attract people. We lost more people than we gained. And if you look at the reason why, it was partly because of the economy in Canada, but also the immigration agents that we sent to Europe during all those periods I found, during the Macdonald period, under Laurier, under Borden, under Mackenzie King, they were told very specifically that yes, of course, as we know, the people we wanted should be British or occasionally a certain small circle of Western European people as well as British, ideally within a narrow range of religions, but also they were to be rural. They were not to be urban. They were under specific instructions, the immigration agents, that if somebody had a trade or an education or entrepreneurial ambitions or a desire to settle in a city in any way, they were to be told, please don't come. You want the United States, that's for you. We wanted farmers, and the two categories of people we wanted were people who owned and ran farms and people who were agricultural laborers. And this includes decades after 1907 or thereabouts, when Canada had ceased to be an agrarian country, when we were a majority urban country. When most of our economy was growth. I mean, the thing that saved us was that the British farmers we brought in, about 7 out of 10 of them never went to a farm and never took part in the wheat boom or anything like that. They settled in cities, they built the economies. But we believed that our cities were a side effect of the wheat boom, that the steel mills in Sydney and Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie were providing rails for the railway and plows for the fields. In fact, they weren't. The CPR didn't buy steel from the Canadian mills. They bought it from the United States and so on. We had a booming economy in steel and electricity and chemicals and automobiles and things like that at that point, but we were refusing to accept it. So there were two, aside from the fact that we didn't gain people, that we lost people during most of the time, there were two other effects of that form of development, of that form of developing by strategically spreading people across the rural land rather than trying to develop an economy that last today. We have two effects that we feel. The first of which is that in order to do that, in order to strategically occupy the land, we needed to get the people off it who were living there. And the plains of Canada were occupied with populations of people who were masters of the global economy, who knew how to take a resource economy and link it to global trading networks and make it profitable and so on. The Cree, the other nations of the plains, had been an integral part of Canadian development before. But of course, because of this shift to a different strategy of population and development, of filling the land with settlers for strategic reasons, not only did the settlers fail, because we didn't have economies, we didn't have the distribution networks in the prairies, so until well into the 20th century, the settlers on the plains tended to fail themselves and move. But of course, the indigenous nations were driven off to reserves, mainly in unarable land in the Shield, and were given provinces that were broken, were strategically starved, and so on. And it brought about a consequence that caused the indigenous population of Canada to fall to 1/10 of the level that it had been at a century earlier, with a set of mechanisms designed to manage that. In other words, we shifted to treating the original people of Canada as being partners in development and confederation, and co-equal nations who were participating in this project to being obstacles, to being problems to be managed through bureaucracies of management. And Canada is still living through the legacy of that today. But the second consequence, of course, was that we did not develop cities. Our cities developed by chance or coincidence, but we saw them as a side effect. And as a result, the major cities of Canada did not develop the way that they do in many other countries, where you start with a center, you treat it as a symbolically and economically important thing, and you build out from there. They developed as agglomerations of housing, with usually some churches as well, spread across the land in a very sparse way. And we're sort of stuck with those two legacies of that form of development now. Now, this period ended, right? I mean, when we came out of the Second World War, with a sudden shock realization that we built our whole country on sort of, as I say, we found ourselves dancing to a song that had stopped playing several minutes earlier. We built our country on this east-west trade with the colonial center that no longer existed as an economy in any way, and found there was only one economy and that we were swamped by it. absolutely. And we had a huge debate, a war of ideas in the 1940s over the question of whether Canada was so underpopulated that we should just give it all, the whole thing up to the United States because we didn't have cities, we didn't have these things. Everything you bought in Canada in the 1940s, everything you saw, everything you listened to a much greater degree than any point in the future, was from the United States. And we had a big debate about population with famous guys like Harold Innis, the economic historian, making big essays in Maclean's and Saturday Night, arguing that if Canada grows above its current population of 12 million, it will be catastrophic for us. Our cities will become blasted ghettos like in the United States. We'll run out of food. We'll have to fill the country up with civilizationally incompatible groups like the Italians, and it'll be a disaster. And we had this war of ideas, and it wasn't really won. I mean, the group that generally sort of won it was the group that said, no, let's remain tiny and let's remain part of Britain. There's a big debate in the 40s about whether we should have a thing called Canadian citizenship, whether there should be a Canadian nationality. And in 1947, in a compromise move, it was legally created. We legally had a thing called Canadian citizenship, but it was a compromise. In order to get both parties to agree to it, we had to have the first clause being a Canadian citizen is a British subject, which remained legally the fact until the end of the 1970s. And the idea that we should remain small and colonial really sort of dominated until just the lived reality of Canada overcame it. And that's another thing, another part of the story in Maximum Canada is how a lot of the changes that we sort of see historically as being big legislative changes or legal changes, we brought in immigration from non-white countries, we had multiculturalism, we had not people who weren't English or French having their some language rights. We had Indigenous awakening. We had all these things. Most of those were after the fact reflections of change that had already happened in the daily lives of Canadians. I mean, by the end of the 1960s, when we started to talk about bilingualism and biculturalism, it was still hugely controversial, the idea that there might be more than one nation in Canada, that there could be an English and a French nation, never mind a set of Indigenous nations and anything else. By the point that we started to have that debate, and Diefenbaker was rising in Parliament and saying, no, if you say there's such a thing as a French-Canadian nation, you'll destroy Confederation. By that point, what later became known as the third force, that is the Canadians who are not of British or French or Indigenous descent, that was a fifth of Canada by the beginning of the 60s, and it was a quarter of Canada by the end of the 60s, before we'd even talked about legalizing immigration from those places. It had become a lived reality. We'd had so many Ukrainians and Italians and Sikhs and Japanese and Chinese and Caribbean people come into Canada by loopholes, by reality, by earlier immigration drives and so on, that they'd become the lived reality on the streets of Canada. And it started to change things. And the ideas that had seemed controversial politically, once they became legislation, were afterthoughts. They were rubber stamps on the reality of Canada. And a part of this was our late realization that we were no longer a colonial country. It meant catching up with a number of things. It meant catching up with the question of Quebec. It meant fighting over the structure of our Constitution. It meant fighting over the recognition of Indigenous nations as constitutional partners in Confederation. It meant fighting over trade with the United States and all these things. And part of my argument is that set of factors that kept people out of Canada, that way of organizing the economy and the Canada-US border and the cities and the development, I call those things the minimizing impulse. And nobody ever really wanted that set of things to add up to nobody coming to Canada or nobody staying. But as soon as you push on one of those dominoes hard, it causes the other ones to topple. If you start with minimizing policies, you end up with all the minimizing policies. You end up with people not staying. And we saw during the last 50 years a sort of push in the other direction of maximizing policies, a recognition that yes, we should be part of a North American economy. Yes, we should be part of a country where Indigenous nations are partners and are recognized as such in the Constitution. Yes, we should recognize that we're multi-ethnic. and therefore are a nation of individuals with rights rather than of collectivities. And yes, we should see ourselves as being a country that develops its own autonomous economies and value-added economies, rather than simply being an extractor of staples for some imperial center, either to the east of us or the north of us. And then once you started pushing on those dominoes, you start moving toward a maximizing impulse and a recognition that population is a problem, and so on. So I'm going to, so now that we're at the present, the question arises, does underpopulation affect us? Is it a thing in our lives? This isn't the 19th century anymore. We don't build countries with numbers with a lot of zeros after them, and we don't have population as a boasting right. We don't need millions of people to fill factories and farms and that sort of thing. We're entering an economy where we might not need a lot of human labor, where a modern two-door refrigerator contains 4 hours of human labor, and that sort of thing. So the question is, does it matter anymore? And well, you know what, I'm going to read you a couple pages because they explain it more simply. This is called The Price of Underpopulation. If you're stuck in traffic on Vancouver's Lionsgate Bridge, or shoulder to shoulder on the King's streetcar in Toronto, or trying to find a free seat on a terrace on Montreal's plateau any summer evening, you might easily be convinced that there are, in fact, too many Canadians. The country's low population density is not usually something you live and feel. It becomes tangible only when you set out to do certain things that require an audience, a market, or the support of an institution or a medium that only a populous country can provide. Then you discover that there's just not enough Canada. If you're an entrepreneur seeking venture capital, an activist fighting for better public services, or a professional searching for the best credentials, then you've probably, at some point, run up against the limits of Canada's population. Same if you're an artist or writer looking for an audience big enough to provide you with a living, an online entrepreneur seeking clicks, a mayor hoping to cover your city with decent public transit, or an environmentalist seeking a big shift to green technology in energy or transportation. For individual Canadians, the most familiar experience of underpopulation is the discovery at some point in your career that you need to leave the country. Almost 3 million Canadians live abroad, 9% of our population, high by standards of developed countries. This shouldn't be seen strictly as a net loss for Canada. Even in a fully equipped country, it's admirable to use the wider world to expand yourself. The problem in Canada is that there's often no other way. On the most basic level, population doesn't matter. Having more people does not by itself make a country more successful. Switzerland, Israel, Norway, and Singapore all have fewer people than the city of London, though their tiny geographies give them a much higher population density, which matters. Nor does population have any effect on democracy or quality of governance. When we talk about Canadian underpopulation, we are not talking about the absolute number of people. More is not better. Rather, the issue with population is one of capacity. Do we have the right people in the right numbers, concentrated closely enough together in the right places to do the things together that we want and need to do? Given our huge geography, our widely dispersed communities, and our wavering dependence on larger foreign markets, do we have a sufficiently high density of taxpayers, consumers, audiences, inventors, specialists, investors, elders and healers, entrepreneurs, caregivers, scholars, activists, and leaders to create the things we need to sustain our standard of living through a potentially difficult future? To determine the effectiveness of our population, we need to examine not the raw totals of people, but the ways in which citizens group together to interact with one another and with the world. We can look at population in a number of ways. First, as a market, that is, as people who will consume the goods and services created by other people. Second, as taxpayers, as people who can provide a fiscal base that will support public institutions and infrastructure at a scale needed by a successful country. Third, as a labor force, as people whose skills and strengths can be put to work in enough numbers to make enterprises function. Fourth, as an audience, as people who consume and support the cultural and media institutions and online resources of the country. Fifth, as clusters of expertise, as groups of skilled and educated people who work closely together, sharing knowledge, enterprise, and funding in order to create new products, services, and scientific advances. Finally, as cities, as pools of people living closely together and sharing resources. A generation of research has shown that high-density cities are disproportionately where economic and creative activity flourishes and where ecological sustainability can best be realized. In other words, Canadians together simultaneously form a market, a group of taxpayers, a labor force, an audience for culture and media, clusters of inventors and entrepreneurs, and a set of urban bodies. At the moment, we have enough people to make things work reasonably well. But if we examine each of these population groupings and their ambitions, we start to see the capacity that is missing, the potential that is unavailable, and the shortfall in human activity that leaves Canada vulnerable and leaves it unprepared for a more challenging economic, institutional, humanitarian, and ecological future. So I examine Maximum Canada, the places where the shortfall in capacity is running Canada into problems. I look at the public cost of low population density, a lack of fiscal resources, which is felt now, will be felt more during the more difficult middle decades of this century when we're going to have much greater expenditures, partly as a consequence of paying for a transition to a green economy, partly because we have an aging population. The figure that governments like to talk about when they talk about population shortfalls is things like the dependency ratio, the oft-cited fact that aging is the largest expense of our government. Even at the moment, old age security is by far the largest single expenditure of the federal government, and it will double in size by the middle of the decade. They like to talk about the dependency ratio, the fact that we now have 4 working age people to support every pension age person who presumably has much higher medical and other social and public expenses. And within 2 decades, that'll be halved to 2 working age people and so on. It's not a very sort of sexy reason to be talking about population, this idea that we should all be popping out babies and bringing people in from abroad to make our balance sheets add up and so on. But it does mean, it is a factor that governments, not just Canada, are talking about, is the difficulty of the lack of fiscal resources we'll have, the fact that we'll need to be cutting important programs to be supporting the current standard of living in the future. The private cost of underpopulation is much stronger. The question of, the way it's often most rudely put is in this current global economy where the things we used to call globalization have retreated and are in the process of retreating, could we have another research in motion in Canada? Can we have another country that employs many tens of thousands of people by going from Canada into an international market? Could we have 20 such countries? Could we have even one? And it's difficult now because, first of all, a lot of, as I said, a lot of those things that those relationships are becoming a lot less easy. A lot of the things we called offshoring are not as easy to do, and a lot of global markets are not what they used to be. A lot of countries, not just the United States, but China, India, and so on, are moving toward nationalist purchasing programs, toward preferential purchasing programs in the public sector that allow only domestic manufacturers to work in their markets, that provide enormous amounts of funding to domestic companies in the form of research and development. All of which are things Canada can do as well, except with the tiny size of our domestic market, we can't really do it in a way that would compete, that would allow people to jump out. And we don't have the clusters of expertise, the clusters of knowledge, the tightly knit circles we don't have a Silicon Valley or a Silicon Roundabout because we don't have those dense clusters. We don't have a Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is as close as you get to it in Canada, and it's a good model, but the level of both physical and data backbone and the level of population density is not enough to support that type of competitiveness. And it'll be difficult in the future as Canada enters a period in the middle decades of this century that I call peak people. Right now, there's a surplus of people moving internationally. Countries like Canada and France and the United States have policies to attempt to limit the number of people that can come in. But as the countries that send people to Canada and to countries like that shift to countries with shrinking populations, which will be the reality in the middle of this. I mean, Iran, a major immigration country to Canada whose middle class immigrated in large numbers, it had 8 children per family in the 80s. It now has 1.7 children per family because of urbanization and because of the education of women. Many of the other sending countries are shifting that way. Part of my ecological argument for Canada maintaining a robust population growth is that our immigration links to the developing world help solve the world problem of population increase. Because we know that the places that send immigrants to Canada develop network links that cause the fertility transition in those sending clusters of villages, that is the shift from a growing to a non-growing family size, to happen much faster in the places that are linked to Canada. If you look at the Philippines, which is the largest source of immigration to Canada and has been for the last decade or so, if you look at the clusters of villages on Luzon, the main island there, the ones that have migratory links to places like Canada have seen their family sizes drop to stability rates or non-rising rates, whereas outside of that, they still are at very high levels. So a very small thing is that our links to the rest of the world cause the rest of the world to develop ecologically and humanitarianly in beneficial ways. But also it means that we're going to be entering a difficult period where countries will be competing for skilled people and families aggressively because the supply will be more limited. Canada will always be attractive to a certain number of people, but it will become much more difficult in the future. So we almost want to get to a sustainable population before that becomes a problem. We want agglomeration economies, as they say, to develop. There's the ecological cost of underpopulation. This is an idea people have trouble getting their heads around. Because we tend to think of each extra unit of human population as being somebody burning up resources and spewing carbon. But the fact is that in a country like Canada that has developed, as I said, sparsely by scattering housing across a wide area, we are in a position where our low population density makes it very difficult to make a transition to a carbon neutral economy in any way. Even our biggest cities suffer very badly from low population density. It's hard to explain to people, as I said in the beginning of that chapter, that when you're stuck on the Lionsgate Bridge, or you're stuck on the Don Valley Parkway in traffic, it's not because of overpopulation that you're stuck in that traffic, it's because of underpopulation. It's because the neighborhoods that surround you on those highways don't have the population density, don't have the people per square kilometer to make it feasible to have rapid electrically fueled public transit networks and intercity rail networks connecting those neighborhoods that would take the load off of those highways and would reduce the traffic. Our cities feel crowded because they don't have the public spaces, they don't have the pathways, they don't have the energy uses that would allow them to ease those congestions right now. You could describe Toronto as a city today, as a city of 4 million people sitting on the infrastructure of a city of 2 million people that needs to get up to 6 million or so before it can have the next snap up in infrastructure to allow it to live comfortably and sustainably with itself. And it's an important transition because once you get above the current level of density of cities, you start seeing some very beneficial ecological effects. All of our cities are past what they call the climate Kuznets curve, which is that they're at the point where each addition of population to the cities decreases the per capita carbon footprint because it causes the transportation distances to shorten, it causes the efficiencies developed within the cities. As they say, 2 cities of 4 million are twice as, 1 city of 8 million is twice as energy efficient as 2 cities of 4 million. And we have a set of problems right now where the development of our cities has sprawled over the previous decades, so we can't have a shift to carbon neutral transportation, heating, energy grid, or building code until we can get to the next level of density that allows us to do that. In other words, allows us to get to a point where we have the density to support rapid public transit, a shift from single-family home to apartment dwelling in more neighborhoods, and a shift to forms of neighborhoods with mixed use and activity that allow things to happen locally rather than across large distances. Fortunately, the markets in Canada are pushing in that direction already. Now, finally, the cultural cost. For anybody who works in an area that requires communication with people or expression to people in Canada, the argument in this book that underpopulation is a problem in Canada is self-evident. It's well known in people in arts, in culture, in media, in politics even. The fact that we do not have the sort of think tanks that political parties can fall back on between elections that allow them to become more intelligent is a problem of the scale of population density. And so on. I mean, I joke that I could have called this book Maximum Canada, or Why a Book Like This Won't Allow Me to Retire at age 55. They decided that wasn't a very good marketing approach for a book like this. But that said, our problems of cultural expression and the ability to have a voice are difficult. He used to use as the chief example the fact that Canada had only ever been able to have one national news magazine because it received $3 million a year in federal government subsidies in order to write editorials denouncing federal government subsidies. Now, the idea of a weekly news magazine is not really an institution that anybody is that interested in anymore, but the fact is that in the online world, it's the same. It's not as if the shift to digital communication has caused the problems of low audience density to cease to be problems. Unless you choose to create a homogeneous, universal product that's marketable in every country and every language, unless you're making one of those emoji websites that people, and there's nothing wrong with them, I use them, that people like anywhere, you're going to run into the problems of limited population just as much as the old print media did. If you're talking about things that can only exist within a Canadian conversation space, or even within an English or French Canadian conversation space, involving sports or politics or many forms of business, or many things involving culture and the arts or cities or things like that, then you're going to run into that problem that the audience is not large enough to support one or two people in a room running the entire operation. It's much more difficult, and so on. So we have a number of areas where we know that the problems of underpopulation are real problems, and more importantly, that they are looming problems in the future. Now, what do we do about this? The number 100 million has become very popular in Canada in recent years. Partly my fault, but I wrote a thing back in 2000 where I interviewed a bunch of demographers on the question of what would be the ideal population of Canada. And what they pointed, and my question was, if we wanted to expand Canada's population without occupying any more land than we currently do, without using any more than the tiny strip of land along the bottom and a couple dots in the middle that we currently live on, without having any more sprawl or anything, just increasing the density of the current areas that we live on, what would be the ideal Canadian sustainable population? And the answer, well, what they said was if that little tiny area of Canadian land had the population density that Northern Europe did, that Scandinavia or the Netherlands did, then we'd have 400 million people here, right? There was a popular answer among many people of 100 million would sort of be ideal. Partly, I think, because that had echoed through Canadian history, that Laurier's goal would have got us to about 200 million by now. The federal government in the 1960s came up with a report saying we should have 100 million. In the early 70s, the Department of Manpower released a study saying that if we can't do certain things economically until we get to 100 million. And there were a bunch of reports during the 2000s suggesting that. And the federal government now has an advisory committee that says 100 million by the end of this century should be the thing. I actually don't know, I don't think that that's a thing to advocate at this point. There's a big reason why the major chapter in this book is called The Case Against 100 Million. First of all, humans are pretty much the only mammal that does not have a homeostatic population. It does not have a steady state. Our population, human populations are always either rising or falling, and there's no point really talking about a target like that. And second of all, because I think we need to talk about incremental growth and that sort of thing, and the idea of having a dream population at 2100 that's going to solve our problems isn't a particularly great way of formulating policy or ideas. People like it because that was the population the United States reached in the 1920s when it started to become a very independent, powerful country. That's also not necessarily a great way to win over Canadians to an idea. It's to say, let's go down that path that the Americans did. But also because we need to recognize that population growth doesn't happen the way it used to happen in Canada. Remember, I talked about that war of ideas we had in the 1940s, that fight over whether we should go above 12 million. That war was won by the facts. We tripled our population. We tripled our population between 1945 and 2015. We did it in a way that was almost invisible to us. It just quietly happened. Lots of noisy stuff happened in Canada. We fought over lots of stuff, but the actual population really was not an issue during that period. And none of the things that Harold Innes and company warned about ended up happening. Our cities did not become horrible ghettos. In fact, they became the most peaceful cities in the world with the lowest crime rates of pretty much any cities in the Western world. And it was provable that the crime rate just dropped because of immigration, because foreign-born people commit crimes at such lower rates than native-born people. We did not run out of food. In fact, the shift of people off the land and into cities meant that the land became much more usable for food production, and we saw a huge increase in agricultural productivity and becoming a net exporter of food and so on. And we did not become impoverished and dominated by the United States. In fact, that tripling of population caused a real rise of Canadian cultural pride and independence and autonomy and the development of and flourishing of a lot of institutions within Canada. That panic about the United States in the 40s caused us to develop things like the CBC and like the Arts Council of Canada and a lot of the big institutions that drive us today. In other words, the idea of having a project of growing made us create the institutions we needed to solve some of those problems of sparse population. So the final question for us is could we do that again? And I think part of the answer is we should have a mentality as if we're going to do that again, even if we don't. Because in many ways, doing what we did in this 70 years after 1945, tripling the population, if we were to do it over the next 80 years or even over the next 180 years, it will not be as easy. It's no longer a matter of simply having people arrive and hoping for the best. We tripled our population over the last 70 years by luck, mostly. We had the right houses at the right prices and the right jobs in the right cities for the right people who arrived at the right time. We would have a panic every 15 years or so and realize, oh my God, we suddenly have a lot more people, let's build some schools, which is why every high school in Southern Ontario looks like it was built in the same year, because it was. But aside from that, we invented things. We invented English as a second language education in the 1950s just by doing it, and got lucky with how we did that. We recognized, unlike other countries, that you don't need to haul kids out of school and teach them English before they can do anything, that you can do it in situ, in the classroom, and that sort of thing. So we had a population who were allowed to integrate before they learned the language and who became robust parts of the Canadian economy and daily life. And became citizens shortly after arriving. We did a lot of things, we were just lucky. The next 80 years are going to be more difficult. The people arriving next are much better equipped than that previous generation of Canadians, most of whom had been born on mud floors and who rose to the middle class in Canada just through hard work, by purchasing houses, by saving money, and so on. That version of the Canadian dream is much more difficult. We have a big housing shortage, as you may have noticed. We need to address the housing supply shortage. because people need, the Canadian model of integration does involve buying a house. It could involve buying an apartment just as well. I mean, we need to destigmatize the word condo as a major part of addressing that housing supply shortage, but we need to deal with that. We need to deal with the fact that the people who settle in Canada now don't go and work at a factory with a lifetime, full-time job with a pension, and so on. They often have a better time in the economy in the long run, but they have multiple entry points. They tend to do what development economists call portfolios of the poor. They do a little bit of contract work here, some buying and selling there, some driving Uber there, some running a little shop there, from working in another guy's shop over there, probably some consulting in whatever area their university degree was in over here, and together that might add up to a T1 that looks as good as a full-time job, but it means there's a lot more fragility in the labor force, and that we don't have the income supports for people trying to balance and juggle these multiple portfolios of work. That's a big problem. And we don't recognize the skills of people coming into Canada. Most newcomers to Canada have university degrees now. 6 out of 10 of them do, twice as much as native-born Canadians do. But only about 2 out of 10 ever end up working in the area that their degree was for. They become hotel desk clerks and taxi drivers and that sort of thing. We waste an entire generation so that people can invest in their children. They put off that extra 2 years of education they need to upgrade their skills because they'd rather pay for their children. So we waste generations of people coming into Canada. So we have a number of structural problems, and of course we have infrastructure shortfalls and things like this as well. The key thing about those things is that, yes, we need to address those problems if we're going to be talking about tripling the population. But we actually need to address all of those problems even if we decide to freeze the population and never have another person enter Canada and keep our birth rate at exactly the level it is now. Even if we had one of those political parties that said shut the borders and never let anyone in, we actually would still need to address all of those problems of growth. We need to address the housing supply shortage. We need to address the labor market structural problems and the problems of income supports. We need to address the problems of skills recognition even between provinces. We need to address the huge infrastructure shortfalls that are preventing transition to a green economy and so on. So we actually need to do all the things that we need to do in order to triple the population, even if we don't triple the population. So the sort of final argument in Maximum Canada is that we need to develop the population tripling mindset. We need to think, let's assume this is going to happen. Because the last couple times the population's tripled, we didn't think it was going to happen, and it just happened. And we weren't really ready. This time, let's assume it's going to happen even if it doesn't happen, because it's a worthwhile Canadian initiative, to coin a phrase. It's a useful set of investments to make and obstacles to remove in Canada to think as if we're going to be tripling. First of all, it means that we can think seriously about making sure that future population growth doesn't use up any larger land envelope than we currently occupy. There's no need to be living on any more land than we do now. We need to keep our green belts and our rural boundaries intact. We need to intensify, not because it's using up prime farmland. The only city that really borders on prime farmland is Vancouver, but because for human reasons and ecological reasons, we have no reason to be occupying more land. We need to develop inward rather than outward. We need to plan for infrastructure. We need to ideally put pressure on this government to make sure that this is the last government that talks about a giant national infrastructure plan without a population plan behind it. Because giant infrastructure plans occasionally coincidentally create infrastructure that's actually useful for future populations, but generally speaking, what they do is they provide infrastructure that's useful for people who voted for the right party. And it's been a waste of money. It's been something that every party has done and that needs a coordinated thing. So there's a need at this point in Canada to have a cross-departmental, cross-government, cross-level of government discussion about population growth. Not because people have necessarily bought the Maximum Canada argument and are going to go ahead with it, but because it's the way to frame your thinking about policy, about how we spend money, about how we place limits on growth, about how we make ecological transitions that allows us to do it in a way that works for the next 80 years and the next several generations of people. So the closing argument of Maximum Canada is let's get together and think about tripling the population, and then maybe we'll decide not to do it, but we'll be better off for having gone through the mental exercise. Thank you very much. And I hope I left some time for questions. Yes, and we have a couple microphones that should be going around. I'm gonna roll this my own, so I will ask. Look, you've all gone to public talks before, so you know. I will ask that you keep it an actual question, and allow room for your neighbors to be able to ask questions as well. And I'm happy to answer questions about anything, because I do a whole lot of other stuff. I will not answer questions about why your Globe and Mail arrived late this morning. Mine also arrived late this morning, so I can't address that one. But aside from that, anyone? Sir.
Yeah, hi. I guess thinking about this, we've all heard about Amazon's pitch. I'm thinking about this talk in particular about Canada's strengths, weaknesses for our cities in that pitch, and whether those kinds of projects themselves are even a worthwhile thing to be doing if we're looking to create this kind of thing. Because it seems to me anyways that it's designed to do these things, but it may not necessarily be in our best interest. Could you talk about the Amazon bid a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really good point and a good example. It was very interesting to watch how we all went nuts and tore ourselves apart over this idea of having a second Amazon headquarters in one of our cities that would employ 40,000 people or something like that. And it was a little like one of those families where someone in the family thinks they've won the lottery and they all go nuts and plan on how to spend it for a little while and that sort of thing, except then you learn that your cousin you hate has actually won the lottery and that sort of thing. But I think it was really useful and look, it's still going on, I suppose. I suppose there's theoretically that Sault Ste. Marie could still become the second Amazon headquarters. No, they put in a bid. And but that said, yes, there is something to be said. Is having a second tier branch plant the thing that we want to be our big national goal? That said, a high-tech company that wants to employ 40,000 people, particularly 40,000 people with STEM degrees and that sort of thing, that is a fairly desirable thing. I can see why any city would want that. The mayor of Winnipeg was very interesting in that he lamented underpopulation as a specific barrier, because Amazon had made it clear that you have to be a city of at least 1 million people to really qualify for that bid. And Winnipeg's at 800,000 now. And Winnipeg very clearly actually could easily have 1 million people and you wouldn't notice the difference. I mean, it's meant to be a bigger city. And he started talking seriously about, okay, well, look, we need to look at Winnipeg's population is there a way to get rid of all those black flies and get people in? And Toronto started getting all Toronto about why don't people like us, and can we use the old Downsview Forces base as the headquarter? It's great for transit, and no, maybe we don't want that, and that sort of thing. And lots of other cities went through it. It was a useful exercise in looking at what you have and what you don't, and imagining if suddenly you were to develop anything that employed 40,000 people, do you have what it takes? Do you have the data pipeline to do it? There are very few places in Canada that actually have the data backbone to do it. There's maybe this block of Kitchener-Waterloo, the area around the lakeshore in Toronto, and not many other places have the data infrastructure. The transportation infrastructure raised questions about that, and it raised questions about population. Yes, we have a lot of people with the right education for that, but are they actually clustered together in centers of knowledge and entrepreneurship and expertise? Have we thought about having places develop where we can have those concentrations of people with the right skills and the right knowledge who are connected in ways to do things like that? Could we develop our own Amazon autonomously, or are there limitations in how we're physically set up and how we're dispersed that would make it very difficult to do that? And I think that exercise has been very useful. And it's been useful in places like Kitchener-Waterloo as well. One of the big things I look at in Maximum Canada is where population growth will happen. Population growth does not happen randomly. You do not want to be distributing people evenly across the land, right? You want people to be concentrating where there's economic activity and so on. Immigrants choose three things when they choose where to settle. The first is known entrepreneurial or employment opportunities, like specific ones. The second is clusters of people and networks of people from similar cultural and linguistic backgrounds who can help them integrate and loan them money and stuff like that. And the third is housing they can afford. And the one that immigrants will always give up is that third. People will very happily settle somewhere where they cannot afford to live if they have those two other things, if they have the employment and the networks of people. People will live 15 people to a room if it gives them that chance to start a business or get a good job and to have people who can help them out and that sort of thing. And we need to recognize that that's where growth will happen, but that's where what they kind of condescendingly call the second-tier cities come into this. The places that have the most important potential for population growth in Canada are the post-industrial cities that have universities in them. That's where immigrants want to settle. That's where you have the potential to turn these places into the next major cities and have the clusters of entrepreneurship and expertise and so on. Hamilton, Kitchener, Waterloo, Red Deer, Kingston, Ottawa, Trois-Rivières, Moncton, Halifax, St. John's. Those are the places that we should recognize kind of need to be hardwired to be places that are turning into larger cities in a different economy. So anyway, as a roundabout way to answer that question, whether or not we want to be the country that gets on its knees and begs Amazon to put its second best people here, whether that's the actual end goal that we want as a country, it's a useful exercise in thinking about how to configure ourselves for that type of an enterprise existing. The next question I will not answer in such length.
Hi, you said that the population of Canada tripled from the 40s to the current period. It just happened, and that we should plan for hopefully that same thing to happen. So it could happen, it might not happen, but one of the things you also talked about was the effect of the revenue base, the tax base, and the fact that the largest portion of the federal government expense is on pensions, and that's going to grow because of the aging of the population. We're living longer. How do we plan for that reality, and what conclusion do you come to if we don't have that population triple again? What happens to us here, our quality of life?
Yeah. In none of these scenarios does Canada become a blasted wasteland that looks like a Mad Max sequel or anything like that, unless the set of ecological consequences of previous choices actually adds up to that for a very large part of the world, in which case I can't guarantee anything. But the problem of the population pyramid aging is one we're going to face in the middle decades of this century. And actually, even if we had a mass immigration program, and I'm not calling for mass immigration, I don't think anybody ever wants mass immigration to return. I mean, if we were going to have we had mass immigration in 1913, and if we had 1913 levels of immigration, we'd have about close to 2 million people a year coming in now. Our most aggressive talk is sort of 425,000 per year or something like that. But even if we went for a mass immigration program, and we would still actually have that problem of an aging population pyramid. It just would be less difficult to handle, and we'd have more fiscal resources to deal with it. Immigrants only temporarily solve problems of aging populations. Mainly because immigrants to Canada, when they arrive, they have a larger family size than average Canadians, but within one generation, they have fallen to the same number of children as Canadians have, pretty much regardless of cultural background and so on. So that's why I don't lean too much on that demographic picture. Lots of governments talk about this difficulty of filling the missing labor pie. And that sort of thing. At some point, the entire world is going to have to learn how to deal with non-growing populations. Japan and Sweden and a bunch of other countries are currently dealing with it. In Germany, I went to a conference of what they call shrinkage studies, which does not involve getting out of the shower on a cold day or anything like that. It's an entire subdiscipline in Germany that they learned about early with the reunification of the former East Germany, about what happens when a city's population falls in half. And it's an interesting set of problems to deal with that we don't want to be dealing with now. At some point, the whole world's going to have to learn to deal with it, but it's tricky. One of the consequences of having a fast-falling population is urban sprawl. When your population declines, suddenly a funny thing happens in real estate prices where it becomes cheaper to buy a spread on the edge of town, and you have massive urban sprawl while also trying to raise taxes to get rid of plumbing and water infrastructure for places that are depopulating. So let's not have to face that set of difficult decisions earlier than we have to. But I should say that we are going to have some interesting policy choices about fiscal decisions around trade-offs around aging expenses in the 2030s and 2040s, no matter what we do.
Hi, so you talked about just the idea of focusing policy around like population. So thinking about population and then thinking about policy and building on it. So I was wondering if you have any examples that you know of in the world right now where you think the country's doing a good job or on its way to actually building policy around like good population like choices or plans for that.
Yeah, that's where Western European countries are somewhat ahead of Canada, in that they have faced problems of non-growing populations earlier. They have populations who are much more adverse to immigration politically, and therefore they have tried to deal with questions of how to address population shortfalls within domestic policy. And that's a whole component of this that's interesting in that it's not all about immigration. Canadians do not have as large families as they want to have. And for a number of reasons, it's useful to address that through domestic policy at the same time as talking about population growth, because first of all, it creates political buy-in. If people are frustrated that they only had 2 kids and they wanted to have 3, and they're going to be a position where they might be envious of immigrants coming in and that sort of thing. If people have the supports they need to have the families that they want to have, then they'll be able to. The average Canadian, when they're in their 20s, say they'd like to have 2.7 children, and they have 1.6. So that shortfall of 0. Not quite 1 child is 7 out of 10 of them say it was for economic reasons. Some people they break up or they have fertility problems or things like that. But economic problems is the number 1. Sometimes that means they can't afford to add an extra room on their house. But most often it means that they can't afford the childcare, which costs $20,000 a year in major Canadian cities per child, and many of us have been through this. And the example of Quebec is an informative one that way. Quebec in 1999 dealt with the problem that Quebec families were way smaller than the Canadian average by a huge margin. They were like 1.3 children per family, while the rest of Canada was 1.8 or something. And they dealt with it by introducing a subsidized childcare program that provided childcare spots for $5 per day. I think it's now risen to 20, but it's still pretty cheap. Which may or may not have been great childcare, may or may not have created other benefits, but it did have the effect of raising the average family size in Quebec considerably, at first to above the Canadian average, and now it's fallen to about the Canadian average. But interestingly, it did it while paying for itself, because the number of women who were able to enter the labor force as a result of that program, the extra income taxes they contributed as a result of that, more than covered the cost of the entire program. So we can have family policy that allows all Canadians to participate in the project of population growth while paying for itself and so on. I'm not a great advocate of this sort of French approach of pop-out babies for the nation and that sort of thing. And I mean, the French president gives out a medal to the mother of the year who has the most children and while keeping the house clean and that so on. We probably don't want to be entering that century again. And this sort of idea of national child-rearing crusades has a bit of a feel of another part of the world in another century and that sort of thing too. But that said, I think the national child care has been an election promise since about 1980, and since it would actually address a fairly large slice of that set of problems, it's worth discussing it as something that should be a freebie.
Given overpopulation elsewhere and Canada's wealth, I do think Canada has a real moral responsibility to share wealth, and one of the ways of doing that is by bringing people in. But regardless of how the population grows, on the other hand, ecologically speaking, I'm just wondering, can the planet afford many millions more people living and consuming at the levels that Canadians do?
Well, I mean, the short answer is no. Squaring the circle between the excessive population growth of some countries and underpopulation and so on of other countries is not quite as simple an equation as it seems. The countries that have out of control populations are not countries that are bursting at their seams and sending immigrants to other countries. Overpopulated countries don't send immigrants. It's actually, and super poor countries don't send either. Niger has the highest average family size in the world. You've heard about it in the news recently. It tends to be countries that are almost entirely agrarian and countries that are in military conflicts that have out of control population growth, and countries that have huge proportions of the population in absolute poverty. Niger does not send immigrants in any significant numbers to the Western world. It's not countries that are overpopulated that do. In fact, the point when countries start to send immigrants to the rest of the world is the point when they reach a certain level of wealth, and when they actually start to have a level of urbanization where family sizes have fallen. I mean, Turkey and Iran started sending immigrants to the Western world in substantial numbers in the most recent part of the world when they stopped being countries with population growth and started being middle-income countries and that sort of thing. And you see that in a lot of places. Bangladesh is heading, toward stable population and so on. So, I mean, the main way to prevent out-of-control population growth from happening, as I said, is link ourselves through migration links to countries that are mixed in this respect, but also help encourage the ending of conflicts and the transition of education of women, the transition of from subsistence to commercial agriculture in the countries that need it. I mean, we should be engaged with those countries. We should be helping with those things. We should recognize that it often doesn't happen naturally. You could say that the world's sort of in a final mile problem, in the sense that getting the number of people, proportion of people in the world who are in absolute poverty, I mean, since 1990, it fell to a fifth of its 1990 level, the proportion of the world in absolute poverty. So we're now in sort of the bottom 15%, rather than the bottom 50% of the world. That last 15% is much more difficult to confront than the first 50% was. It's people who are harder to reach, who are in countries that are in conflict situations that are much more difficult. But we know that for ecological sustainability, reaching that bottom 15% is the most important. Those are the people who will be vulnerable to climate change. Those are the people who will suffer under climate change. The people who are subject to climate migration, as we call it, who will be subsumed under a much larger rural to urban shift, they're the ones who will be doing fine because they have moved to a place where they are no longer as economically vulnerable, where they're living in cities that can afford defenses against climate change and so on. It's the people who are stuck in that bottom 15% of income who we need to reach because they're the most vulnerable. And that's a national project that I'm not going to try to pretend that population policy or something is part of that. That's something that's a moral obligation, and that's something we can help with. It doesn't involve taking people in as refugees or immigrants from those places necessarily. Those are also moral and sometimes legal obligations. But it involves having forms of engagement that deal with those problems as those problems by themselves. So we shouldn't think that we're going to have some natural sort of virtuous circle mechanism that's going to solve all the world's problems simply by solving our domestic problems at some point. But we would like to be a country that has the resources at home, that has a robust and sustainable enough population, a robust enough fiscal base, a functioning enough economy, that we can be a country that has the resources to be able to help the rest of the world with its problems. That rather than being a country that's subject to problems of decline and internal conflict, that we're helping other countries with those problems, rather than being a country that's subject to loss of employment and human livelihoods through artificial intelligence and automation and so on, that we're one of the countries that flourishes within those systems, that exports those technologies and helps the rest of the world, that we can use an educated, prosperous, smart, densely concentrated population in order to be a problem-solving country rather than a problem country. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I wanted to say a few things kind of in the formal closing of the evening. The first is my wife is 8.5 months pregnant, so we're doing our part.
Congratulations.
We're doing our part, right? No, I know, and more seriousness. I mean, I think I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Aaron. It's nice to meet you all. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And the thing that I like the most about my job is being challenged to think and being challenged to think differently. And I think that's what you did here tonight, because, you know, there's this pervasive political discourse almost anywhere you look now that immigration is bad, or that it's a dirty word, or that we need to think differently about our immigration policies to protect ourselves from the other. And what you're saying is actually that immigration may be, or in fact is, our salvation. It's economically necessary, it's ecologically necessary, and it's good for the future. So I think thank you for challenging us here tonight to think differently. And my final thought is, you've left me wondering, you know, is because it is the way that it is, doesn't necessarily mean that it is the way that it should be. So I look forward to reading your book. I know that it's on sale outside.
Indeed,
so,
yes.
Yeah, so ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask you to help me thank our speaker, Doug Saunders, for an excellent job. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everybody.
Nicely done.